Hi friends, this is Worldmaker Books and I'm Joy. We are here today to read Black and White by Mark Wandry, and we're going to get started right away with the prologue. Pacific Cetacean Research Institute, Molokai, Hawaii, Earth, May 19th, 2035. Dr. Matthew Clark watched the ocean from his office balcony at the PCRI. There was a dense bank of clouds to the northeast, which looked like it might be over them by midday. Not uncommon in Molokai in the spring, yet still annoying. He turned his head and looked at the computer through his out-of-date prescription glasses, scowling slightly. A budget spreadsheet was displayed with a lot of red entries. Tourism was down, way down. Kaunakakai still got a lot of traffic from tourists trying to get off the beaten path, sure, but they weren't looking to see tanks full of stressed cetaceans in the process of being rehabilitated. Nobody was interested in whales and dolphins anymore, not with aliens coming to visit. Hearing a high-pitched whining, he looked to the south. There was one of the multi-fanned air cars they called flyers coming in over the ocean, no doubt from Honolulu. If what Matthew had heard was true, they needn't have worried. The alien-manufactured craft were safer than the kiddie rides in an amusement park. The Galactic Union, he said, shaking his head. He'd been a scientist all his adult life, dedicated to the pursuit of truth. The existence of many thousands of alien races in the galaxy was an undeniable scientific truth. He'd seen many images on TV, and had even met a couple the previous year during a scientific symposium in Washington, D.C., held by the New World Government. They'd been installing Earth's first GalNet node, the Union's version of the Internet, but on steroids. A decade ago, he'd been a relatively young researcher doing postgraduate work on deep ocean sea life in the Atlantic when first contact was made. The aliens landed in New York City and began negotiations to bring humanity into the Galactic Union. It had seemed to be going pretty well, until some Iranian-sponsored terrorists blew up the UN. Many of Matthew's friends considered that almost a public service. The UN was a constant pain in the marine research community's ass, after all. The problem was, the bomb also killed the alien ambassador, one of the owl-like race known as Buma. She'd perished, along with several of her Minsha guards. The Buma were inclined to be forgiving. The Minsha were not. Those aliens looked like huge praying mantises and fought like demons. Iran and many of the surrounding countries no longer existed. "Dr. Clark?" he heard from his intercom. "Yes, Sheila. There's a tour group due in an hour." "Get Benjamin to take them through," Matthew said. The young grad student was both competent and passionate about cetaceans. He always managed to get some good donations. "They've requested the director personally," Sheila said. "Who is it?" "Someone named Koduku," she said. "Are they Kama'aina?" he asked, referring to native islanders. "No, Doctor, they're aliens." "Oh," he said, and quickly headed downstairs. The Institute had started life as a posh resort, but had suffered from crib death. Financing had fallen through before it was completed due to the economic downturn in 2008. In 2033, it was purchased by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, not long after they were ported over from the USA to the world government, and their responsibilities expanded to ocean life conservation. With some fresh funding, they set about rehabilitating cetaceans abandoned by ill-fated parks around the world. Their problem had always been getting enough funding. The world government kept their doors open and paid their salaries, but had never given them quite enough money to make a difference. When Dr. Clark had come on board in 2034, just over a year ago, he'd formed a conservatory endowment with help from some rich family friends. It allowed them to improve their outreach and bring in some tourists. People had liked whales and dolphins, at least until the aliens had become more popular. Matthews waited impatiently for the elevator to arrive on the top floor, where the administration offices were located. While he was waiting, his son Terrence came running up. "Did you hear?" he said, his eyes wide with the kind of excitement only a 10-year-old could manage. "Yes, Terrence, I heard." "Terry, Dad," he said, rolling his eyes. "Call me Terry." Terry is the name you give a street sweeper, Matthew thought. He'd never preferred Matt. He refused to understand why his son now insisted on being called Terry. "Where's your mother?" "She's down at the docks waiting for the fishing ship," he explained. "She heard a trawler had a large load of hapu-upu'u they were trying to get rid of." Matthew grunted in understanding. Hapu-upu'u, also known as Hawaiian sea bass, wasn't a particularly popular fish. More often found in sushi, it had fallen out of favor. If the boat was unable to sell it, the fish was probably getting ripe. The Institute was a well-known market of last resort to many of the fishing boats. 9 orcas and 19 Pacific bottlenose dolphins ate a lot of fish every day. If the boat captain could make fuel money and the Institute could get some still edible fish, a meeting of the minds was possible. The elevator arrived, and Terry, practically bowled his father out of the way. Shaking his head, Matthew followed his son in and pressed the button for the visitors level. Terry danced from foot to foot as the elevator descended, even reaching out to push the visitors level button again, as if it would speed their descent. "Patience," Matthew said. "You don't want to make a poor impression on our visitors, do you?" "No, Dad," Terry said. With visible effort, he composed himself. Very good, Matthew thought, but felt a barely suppressed thrill run up his own spine. Aliens! Here! At my institute! He realized their arrival likely explained the flyer as well. Few but the super rich could afford those yet. The elevator dinged and the doors slid open. Terry possessed just enough presence of mind to allow his father to exit first. Matthew walked out into the rotunda to find a huge tour group composed of mostly typical tourists, dressed in shorts, brightly colored shirts, and a plethora of floppy hats and sunglasses. There were around 30 of them, and they'd created a crescent around 2 more members of their group. One looked for all the world like a 2-meter-tall bear standing on its back legs, except that bears on Earth weren't bright purple. The other alien was a meter-tall bipedal gecko. Benjamin Anderson, the assistant he'd asked to take the tour, was talking to the gecko and turned when Matthew stepped into view. He moved forward, and the lizard followed. "Dr. Matthew Clark, may I introduce you to Koduku?" Benjamin said, and gestured to the lizard with a bow. "He's a member of the race known as the El Shah." Matthew nodded, came a little closer, and gave a slight bow, a greeting he knew many aliens used. Shaking hands wasn't something most of them understood. "An honor to meet you," he said. Koduku made some hissing and clicking noises, then a clearly understood English voice said, "The honor is all mine." The voice emanated from a silver medallion hanging around Koduku's neck. A translator, Matthew realized. The incredibly powerful little computer translators were starting to turn up in places on Earth. The government had quite a few, as did some large corporations. Now programmed with most languages on Earth, they were breaking down national boundaries in a way even being bombed by aliens hadn't managed. "I understand you research marine mammals here," Koduku asked. "We call them cetaceans," Matthew offered. Cetaceans are a clade, a monophyletic group of marine mammals. He added a bit of a questioning tone in his voice, uncertain if the alien would understand, then berated himself for doing it that way, realizing it was unlikely the computer would render such an inflection to his voice. "I understand," Koduku replied. "Oh, are you a scientist?" "Life sciences," the alien replied. "My consortium reworks starships from existing designs to suit various other species. I'm here to meet with some of your primitive space contractors and discuss a possible expanding market." He shrugged, a disconcerting gesture for a meter-tall lizard. "I think bothering with a merc race is a waste of time, but my boss doesn't agree." We don't all make our money killing things," Matthew replied, a little put off by the alien's backhanded swipe at his world. Though human mercenaries were increasingly leaving to go fight off-planet, he didn't approve. The so-called mercs made inconceivable amounts of money, but it was all wasted on more guns. He got angry just thinking about what he could do with a fraction of that money. Galactic Union credits were worth thousands of dollars apiece on Earth. "You are a strange race, this is true," Koduku agreed. "However, you are also apparently pretty good at killing, despite your complaints. What do you call your leading merc companies? 4 ponies?" "The 4 horsemen," Terry offered from just to Matthew's side. He'd forgotten his son was there. "A hatchling human?" Koduku asked. "My son," Matthew said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder and moving him forward. "This is Terrence Clark." Terry shot his father a disapproving look for not using his proper name, then looked back at the El Shah. He was clearly piqued by the fact Koduku was maybe a couple centimeters taller than him. "How old are you, Terrence Clark?" Koduku asked. "I'm 10, Terry answered. "Do you also study these cetaceans?" "I helped Dad out," he said as he looked at his father. "I'm too young to get a job, though." Matthew and Benjamin both laughed. It was well known Terry thought he should get paid for the work he did. The boy didn't entirely appreciate the tradition of working for the family business on a pro bono basis. "He'll help on the tour." Matthew looked at the crowd of tourists, who were all curiously looking at the aliens instead of the massive 50,000-liter tank behind the 10-centimeter Lexan wall to their left. A pair of dolphins raced by, unnoticed. The big purple bear followed the animals with its tiny black eyes. "May I inquire as to your friend?" He indicated the Ursine. "Friend?" Koduku turned and almost seemed startled to notice the other alien. "Oh, him? He's just an Ugar merc, a company-hired bodyguard." The Ugar regarded Matthew with cold detachment. As Matthew suspected, the tourists were an impromptu retinue Koduku and his bodyguard had picked up when their flyer landed nearby. More curious about the pair of aliens than a marine biology institute, they'd simply followed the off-worlders inside and continued to tag along. Matthew began his tour with an informative film on the different types of marine mammals and what made cetaceans unique. It eventually moved on to why they were in danger and various types of conservancy. A bit on the end of the movie thanked the guests for their interest and encouraged them to support the Institute's nonprofit endeavors. The next step was the part most tourists were the least interested in: the inner workings of the Institute's 6 huge seawater aquariums and 2 habitats. However, this was the part which interested Koduku the most. He wanted to know all manner of details concerning heat exchangers, pump capacities, filter workings, and even what kinds of alloys went into the pipes. Matthew ended up calling his chief engineer in from his lunch to answer the questions. Koduku took little notice of his bodyguard's difficulties in maneuvering around the various tighter areas. The El Shah's diminutive size made the passageways no more difficult than if Matthew were walking down a city street. The Ugar nearly got stuck twice. The second time required 3 technicians to undog a door from its top to free the alien. If anything, Koduku found it amusing. "They're brutish, but reliable in a fight," he told Matthew quietly at one point. "To be perfectly honest, I didn't expect much more from you humans until I got here." He examined a huge seawater pump humming with power. "Your engineering, while lacking finesse, has potential." "Thanks," Matthew said out of the corner of his mouth. "Think nothing of it." As the tour moved on to the reason for the Institute, the cetaceans, Koduku seemed less interested to the point of indifference. Matthew would have assumed he only stayed out of a sense of common courtesy, except the alien didn't seem to possess the trait. He didn't ask any more questions, merely watching the dolphins leaping meters out of the water to intercept thrown fish with one of his 2 independently controlled eyes. The Ugar was slightly more curious, though only slightly. When they reached the first of the 3 large orca tanks, Koduku perked up slightly as he caught sight of one of the 4 new Russian resident orcas. Cray, the dominant male, breached to get a better look at the visitors. The orca's head hovered a short distance out of the water, his eye examining the Ugar for a long moment before submerging. "Why are they here?" Koduku asked. "All our cetaceans are rescues of one kind or another. These 4 are from Russia and were once on display at a park." The El Shah cocked his head. "A place where they're kept for amusement, sometimes for education as well." "Terry!" Matthew looked over and saw his wife Madison coming in, with 2 men and a tub of fish in tow. He smiled. She'd made a deal. His son left them and went over to his mother, helping her with the fish. "You humans enjoy seeing and experiencing other species?" "Yes," Matthew said. The El Shah shook his long head, both eyes going over different parts of the human tourist group at the same time. "I think scientists will be trying to understand humans for a long, long time." Matthew looked over to where his son was feeding Cray. Terry had a feeding pole 3 meters long and telescoping, with cotton twine holding a large hapa'upu'u out over the tank. The familiar shape and grayish color of the Hawaiian sea bass dangled just above the surface. Cray's great shiny black head broke the surface, and I examined the fish for a second, and he submerged again. "Dad, Cray won't take the bass." The orca tossed its head, and Matthew felt the distinctive, ultra-low frequency feeling of the orca pulsing his sonar. "I saw," Matthew said. "We'll have to do some blood tests and see if there's a problem." "There is nothing wrong with the creature," Koduku said. Matthew turned back to look at the alien, who was observing the orca. The 2 seemed to be staring at each other. "My apologies, but how do you know our orca is well?" "Because he told me." Matthew shook his head, not understanding. Koduku focused both eyes on Matthew for a moment, then placed a hand on his head. "Oh, right, you don't have ready access to these." He placed another hand on the pendant hanging around his neck. "One moment." The El Shah reached into a pouch around his waist and removed another pendant and one of the small computers they called slates. Koduku touched the slate a couple of times, closed his eyes, and the slate flashed. He placed the pendant on top of the slate, and both flashed red, and then he handed the pendant to Matthew. "What do I do with this?" Matthew asked. "Place it near your mouth," was the reply. Matthew did as he was told, and Koduku pointed at the orca, which wasn't looking at him. "Now what?" he asked. The orca pulsed his sonar directly at Matthew, and he shook his head from the power of it. Then the pendant spoke in strangely accented but understandable English. "I no like funny fish." Matthew's eyes were open wide in shock as he looked from Cray to Koduku and back to Cray. "Was that you speaking?" he asked. The pendant he was holding thrummed against his skin, the frequency similar to the one the orca used. In adjacent tanks, several other orca heads popped out of the water. Cray rolled slightly in the water. The move was eerily similar to the way a dog cocked its head. "Yes, I speak. I hear you speak me." Matthew almost dropped the translator in surprise as he turned to look at Koduku. Then he laughed out loud. "Holy shit," he said, and Cray laughed as well, bobbing his head up and down in an unmistakable nod of his huge head. Terry watched his father, the young man's mouth hanging wide open and the fish dangling, forgotten. Matthew knew the world had just changed for him in ways he might never fully understand. He was also more excited than he could ever remember being in his entire life. "I think I'm going to go buy Cray a tuna," he said. Cray nodded with even more vigor. Part 1. The Tower of Babel. Chapter 1. Kaunakakai Elementary School, Molokai, Hawaii, Earth, August 10th, 2035. Terry leaned as far forward as he could without falling over and watched the pitcher. The boy glanced at the runner on first base, then back forward. Terry grinned. The pitcher had forgotten he was there. He led off several steps as the pitcher wound up. Terry glanced at the shortstop, who glanced at him. The shortstop's eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to yell. Too late. The pitcher released the ball. At the same instant, Terry broke into a sprint. The shortstop barked a warning as the ball went tink against the batter's bat and bounced against the ground, hopping up just enough that the pitcher's frantic jump for it fell a good half-meter short. Terry passed the shortstop, tossing a wink to the kid, who snarled a furious curse in Polynesian. He cut around third, his foot just touching the base, and straightened out for home. "Go, go, go!" the third base coach yelled as he passed, and Terry ran. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the shortstop take a shot at catching the first base runner. The kid there had to jump a little to catch the ball, and the runner tagged before the first baseman came back down. Safe! He made up for missing the tag by making an incredible sideways throw. Terry took 2 long-running steps and dove for home. The catcher reached for the ball, nabbed it, and swept his big mitt toward Terry, who slid just under it. "Safe!" the umpire called, and the parents of his team cheered. "Terry Clark scores!" the announcer yelled, and his team came out of the dugout to high fives. The game over, Terry and his team were sitting in the dugout, a humidifying fan blowing on the kids as they drank ice-cold sodas. It was the 3rd year Terry had played on the Mokoka Summer League, and they were getting good. There were co-eds in the advanced group that played all over the island. Most of his friends played with him, and despite the midsummer heat, it was the second best time of year for him. "You suckered the pitcher big time," Yui said. "I saw he didn't check second very often, even when a runner was on," Terry said, and Yui winked at him. Yui Tanaka played second base, while Terry was a shortstop. As their positions were next to each other, they'd learned to depend on each other. Last year, the two had discovered their other passion, besides baseball, of course. "Okay, team," the coach said to get their attention. "We're undefeated, so that means we get to go to the All-Island Tournament on Oahu next week." The kids all cheered and pumped their fists in the air. "Practice Wednesday, make sure your uniforms are clean, and I'll call your parents to give arrangements for the shuttle to Honolulu." Terry raced Yui out to their bikes. They tossed the empty soda cans into a recycling bin and unlocked the bikes. "You hear from Doc?" Yui asked as she took her phone and started her bike. "Yeah," Terry said, starting his own bike. "He says to meet him at Kilauea Pond Place." "Oh, cool," she said. Terry verified his bike had enough charge. From Kaunakakai Elementary School to Kilauea Park was just over 2 miles. He'd had his bike plugged into the baseball field's common solar bank, but the weather was a hazy overcast, and 30 other kids were charging their bikes, too. His phone said the bike was good for 3.5 miles. He made a face as he jumped on and followed her. Yui was already heading down the driveway toward Iloa Street. He had a 20-watt panel in his backpack, sure. While they're out with Doc, it would give him a little juice. Probably not enough to get back to the Institute, which would mean pedaling up the hill. He could ask Yui to pedal part of the way with him. He shook his head. For some reason he didn't want to admit, he'd screwed up and hadn't put his bike on the charger last night. He gritted his teeth and used the electric motor to catch up to her. The early afternoon traffic along Route 450, Mauna Loa Highway, was busy. August was tourist season, and things had picked up since the aliens moved in. A dozen of them were always coming and going from the Institute, and groupies were also coming and going. Aliens were cool and all, but who wanted to follow a big stinky purple bear around, or one of those monkey-looking maquis? Yesterday, something that looked like an anteater had been talking to his mother. Gross. Buzzing along at 15 kilometers per hour, they were soon passing Paddlers, then Molokai Burger. He was hungry after the game and hoped Yui would pull in for a snack. No such luck, she sped on by. One of the Kaunakakai police officers was standing on the opposite corner, talking to an El Shah about something. He waved at Terry, who waved back. The El Shah focused one eye on Terry for a second before pivoting it back to the cop. Mauna Loa slowly descended to just a few meters above sea level. Terry enjoyed the cool ocean breeze as he nursed his low battery while keeping up with Yui. At one point, she looked back at him lagging and waved for him to keep up. He smiled and waved back, glancing down at the phone locked onto the handlebar. Only 10% battery remaining. Crap. The last of the town fell behind them, and the ocean was just to the left as they rode. Finally, a small coconut grove appeared between them and the ocean, and he heaved a sigh of relief. They turned on Kapuaiwa Road as his battery indicator started flashing at 5%. He switched to pedals for the last 100 yards. The road turned to the right, becoming Pond Place. However, if you went a little further without turning, there was a dirt turnaround which put you on the beach. There, just offshore, floated an old red and white trawler that had seen better days. A man so suntanned most people would guess he was African American was sitting on the fantail, messing with gear. "Yo, Doc!" Terry yelled. The man looked up, shading his eyes from the glare, and waved. "You want I should bring the skiff over?" Terry looked at Yui, who stuck her tongue out and shook her head. "Nah, we'll be right there." They locked their bikes and sealed their backpacks, making sure the tape locked in place. The contents would stay dry for hours, maybe days, even underwater a few meters. "Last one, there's a sea turtle turd," Yui said, and sprinted for the water. "Damn it!" Terry yelled, jamming his finger onto the lock icon for his bike. He stuffed the phone into his front pocket, zipping it as he ran, and somehow got his backpack in place, too. Despite her head start, he was a better sprinter, and by the time her feet hit the water, he was only 2 steps behind her. Almost in tandem, they leapt into a wave just as it reached them. In the water, they were equals. Try as he might, though, Terry was unable to catch her before she made it to the boat's transom 1 stroke before he did. "You're a sea turtle turd," Yui crowed as she flipped up onto the diving deck. "Shut up," Terry mumbled. "Sorry, what? Did you say I won?" "You kids knock it off," Doc said. Terry looked up at Doc, who was now on the flying bridge. He didn't know how old the man who called himself Doc was. Maybe 60? Who knew? Terry knew he'd lived in Hawaii all his life, growing up in the warm Pacific waters. He thought maybe Doc was a doctor of some kind. He'd met the man and his ship on a fishing charter their family had taken the year they'd arrived on Molokai. He was average height for most adults, with a thick body and heavily muscled arms. Despite his age, his abdomen showed a fully defined six-pack that made Terry hoped he looked that badass when he grew up. The shaved, bald head was cool, too, but his mom wouldn't let him shave his own head. Charters were his main source of income, mainly fishing, but also diving. It had been Terry's introduction to diving, and probably the most exciting moment in his life. After they'd moved to Hawaii, the excitement of surf and sun quickly wore off, and it became just another place to live. Then he dove underwater with a scuba tank, and everything changed for him. It was like being on another world, another universe. He could glide like a bird in a reality full of infinite variety. Each moment revealed another new thing, a new fish, a new coral formation. Anything was possible. Since the first time, he'd spent every moment he could steal underwater. He'd even introduced Yui to it as well. Through it all, Doc had been his guide and teacher. "Good baseball game?" Doc asked, messing with the boat's controls. "Yeah," Terry said. "We won." Doc nodded and hit the starter. The boat looked old and worn, yet it started with the roar of a well-maintained machine. "Let's dive." Okay, I'm going to stop there for today because the next step is chapter 2. That's the end of a chapter. We appreciate you taking your time to listen to us today. At some point, I will go through the comments, probably as we're close to the end of the book. We're at 5% right now, as I'm reading on my Kindle. At some point, we'll go through all of the comments and draw a couple of names to give away a couple of paperback copies that are signed. So if you like this video, please leave a comment telling us what you like about Mark's work, or what your favorite Four Horsemen Universe book is, or what your favorite book of Mark's in general is, because he has 2 other series as well as the Four Horsemen universe. And let's see. Oh, please, if you liked this video, the thumbs up button for me, and please click subscribe. It all helps. And if you've got a friend you think might like this book or any of Mark's books, please feel free to share the video. We appreciate it, and we will see you again on Wednesday. Thanks. Bye.